A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
So, Herman, I was looking at some global polling data this morning, and it is truly striking how much of an outlier we are here in Israel. If you look at the United States, or the United Kingdom, or France, there is this almost universal law of political physics. The younger the voter, the more they tend to lean toward the left of the spectrum. The youth are traditionally the progressive engine, the ones pushing for radical social change and internationalism. But then you look at the data coming out of early 2026, and the trend is almost perfectly inverted. It is a mirror image of the Western world.
That aligns with what we discussed back in episode 981 when we looked at the fading pro-Israel consensus in the West. While young people in the West are drifting toward more progressive, often anti-nationalist or post-colonialist stances, Israeli youth are doing the opposite. According to the latest figures from the March 17th surveys, over 60% of Israeli voters under the age of 30 now identify as right-wing or center-right. In some specific sub-demographics, that number climbs even higher. It is a fundamental divergence in how the next generation views the world.
And our housemate Daniel actually sent us a prompt about this very thing. He wants us to dive into the historical trajectory of Israeli political movements to understand how we got here. He is asking about the major eras of political thought in this country, from the founding pioneers to the current government in 2026. It is a big ask, but I think it is the only way to explain why the 18-year-olds of today look so different, politically speaking, than the 18-year-olds of 1948 or even 1992. We have to look at the structural evolution of the state itself.
Daniel always has a knack for picking the topics that require a deep dive into the archives. To understand the youth of today, you really have to understand the collapse of the old hegemonic structures. We are not just talking about a change in preference, like choosing a different brand of cereal. We are talking about a shift in the national psyche, a movement from a collectivist, socialist foundation to a security-first, individualistic, and increasingly traditionalist reality. It is the story of a nation moving from the communal dining hall of the kibbutz to the high-tech fortified towers of Tel Aviv and the ideological settlements of the Judean hills.
I want to be clear for our listeners that when we use terms like right-wing in an Israeli context, it does not always map perfectly onto the American or European definitions. In the West, right-wing often implies a specific stance on taxes or healthcare. In Israel, the axis is primarily defined by security, the approach to the conflict, and the definition of national identity. Economics plays a role, but it is often secondary to the existential question of how the state survives. So, Herman, if we are defining the major epochs, we have to start with the founding giants.
We have to look at the Mapai era. From 1948 until 1977, Israel was essentially a one-party state in practice. The Mapai Party, which later became Labor, was the dominant force. This was the era of David Ben-Gurion, defined by secular socialist Zionism. Everything was centralized. The labor unions, specifically the Histadrut, were not just unions. They owned massive chunks of the economy, including the largest bank, the largest construction company, and the healthcare system. If you wanted a job or a house, you basically had to have the right party card. They called it the Pinkus Adam, the little red booklet.
It is incredible to think about now, especially given how marginalized the Labour Party has become in 2026. Back then, the party was the state. The ideology was very much about the new Jew, a secular, hard-working pioneer who had shed the perceived weaknesses of the diaspora. They wanted to create a society of farmers and soldiers. The kibbutz movement was the ideological vanguard. But even then, while the surface looked like a socialist monolith, there were deep-seated resentments forming under the floorboards.
Oh, definitely. While the elites were secular Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, the country was rapidly changing. You had massive waves of immigration from Middle Eastern and North African countries, the Mizrahi Jews. They were brought into a system that viewed their culture and traditional religious practices as primitive. They were sent to development towns on the periphery, often in the middle of the desert, while the Ashkenazi elite stayed in the center. They were economically marginalized and socially looked down upon. That resentment built up for 30 years, and it was the fuel for the first great shift in Israeli politics.
Which leads us to the first major pivot point, the 1977 Mahapak, or the upheaval. This is when Menachem Begin and the Likud party finally broke the Mapai hegemony. I think people today forget how shocking that was. It was like the sun rising in the west.
It was a political earthquake of the highest magnitude. Begin did something that changed the DNA of the Israeli right. He formed an alliance between the revisionist Zionists, who had always been the political outsiders, and the Mizrahi community. He did not talk down to them. He respected their traditionalism and their faith. He used the language of Jewish pride and national dignity. He brought the periphery into the center of Israeli politics. This era, from 1977 through the 80s, was about the democratization of the Israeli identity. It was no longer just the secular kibbutznik who represented the state, it was the shopkeeper in Jerusalem and the factory worker in Kiryat Shmona.
And that period also saw the beginning of the shift away from the command economy. Begin started the process of liberalization, though it took decades to really take hold. More importantly, it shifted the security narrative. The Likud brought a more hawkish, uncompromising stance to the table. They were more skeptical of the old elite's belief that they could manage the region through traditional diplomacy. They believed in the Iron Wall, the idea that only through overwhelming strength would the Arab world eventually accept Israel's existence.
You've hit on something there. But then we hit the third major era, which I would call the Oslo era. This is the 1990s. You have Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. After the first Gulf War and the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this immense sense of global optimism. This was the era of the new Middle East. The idea was that through territorial compromise, we could achieve a lasting peace and become a normal nation. It was the peak of the Israeli center-left's vision.
I remember the imagery from that time. The handshakes on the White House lawn. It felt like the end of history was arriving in the Middle East just like it had in Europe. And for a while, the Israeli public was largely on board. They wanted a normal life. They wanted to be able to travel to Amman and Cairo. We actually discussed the economic side of this in episode 991, how the transition from the communal kibbutz ethos to the high-tech startup nation began to accelerate here. People wanted to build businesses and join the global economy.
But that is where the wheels came off, and this is the most critical part of the story for understanding the youth of today. The Oslo process did not lead to the new Middle East. It led to the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. We are talking about years of suicide bombings in cafes, on buses, and in shopping malls. For the generation that was coming of age in the year 2000, the peace process was not a noble experiment that failed. It was a lethal mistake that put their families in danger. They did not see peace. They saw blood on the sidewalks of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem.
That is the trauma that fundamentally broke the Israeli center-left. If you were a teenager in Jerusalem in 2002, your primary political reality was not a debate about tax rates. It was a question of whether you would make it home from school without a bus blowing up. That experience created a massive generational disillusionment with the Land for Peace model. It made the entire concept of territorial compromise seem like a form of national suicide to a lot of people. When the left said, if we give up land, we will get peace, and the result was the exact opposite. The left lost its credibility with the youth.
And that is the environment that birthed the current era, the era of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Security First doctrine. Netanyahu's longevity in politics is largely because he spoke directly to that specific trauma. He offered a doctrine of management rather than resolution. The idea was that we cannot solve the conflict because there is no reliable partner, so we must manage it through overwhelming strength, technological superiority, and economic prosperity. He told the public, I will keep you safe and I will make the country rich, and for a long time that was a winning formula.
So, let us look at the youth demographic specifically in 2026. Why is this trend of rightward drift so much stronger among the young than their parents? Most of the people currently in their late teens and early 20s have no memory of the pre-Oslo era, and they certainly have no memory of the optimism of the 90s. Their entire lives have been defined by the failure of the peace process, the rise of Hamas in Gaza, and the regional threats from Iran and its proxies. To them, the left's rhetoric sounds like a foreign language from a dead civilization.
Right. To a 20-year-old Israeli today, the idea of a two-state solution sounds like a fairy tale from a different century. They see the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, which was supposed to be an experiment in peace, and they see it resulting in thousands of rockets and the horrific events of the last few years. They see the West Bank and they think, if we leave there, the same thing happens but on a much larger scale, overlooking our main airport. It is a very pragmatic, almost clinical hawkishness. It is not necessarily born of a desire for conflict, but of a deep-seated belief that there is no partner for peace.
And there is a demographic component here that we cannot ignore. This is something we touched on in episode 1247 regarding the new demographic reality. The birth rates in Israel are vastly different across political and religious lines. The secular, left-leaning population in Tel Aviv has a birth rate similar to Western Europe, maybe 2 children per woman. But the religious Zionist and Haredi communities have much higher birth rates, sometimes 6 or 7 children per family.
It is a numbers game, Corn. The Haredi population is doubling every 20 years or so, and the religious Zionist community, which is the backbone of the right-wing ideological movement, also has very large families. So, every election cycle, the pool of new voters is naturally skewed toward the right simply because of who is having the most children. But what is truly notable is that it is not just the religious kids. Even secular youth are trending right. The secular right is a massive and growing demographic.
That is the part that I think confuses outside observers the most. They see a tech-savvy cosmopolitan kid in a coffee shop in Tel Aviv, and they assume that person must be a Western-style liberal. But in Israel, tech savviness is often decoupled from social liberalism. You can be a world-class coder who loves global culture and Netflix, but when it comes to the security of your family, you are a hardline hawk. The youth here are very nationalistic. They take pride in the flag, they take pride in their military service, and they view the international criticism of Israel as a form of deep-seated hypocrisy.
There is also the echo chamber effect. The traditional media in Israel, the big newspapers and the main TV channels, were historically seen as bastions of the old left-wing elite. The younger generation does not consume that media. They are not watching the 8 o'clock news. They are on Telegram, they are on the platform X, they are watching independent right-wing channels like Channel 14. They feel that the old media lied to their parents about the prospects for peace, and they are looking for a more assertive narrative.
It is also worth noting how the education system has changed. Over the last 20 years, there has been a much greater emphasis on Jewish identity and Zionist history in the national curriculum. Not necessarily in a religious way, but in a way that emphasizes the historical right of the Jewish people to the land. When you combine that with the lived experience of the security situation, you get a generation that is very comfortable with the idea of a Jewish nation-state and very skeptical of universalist ideologies that they see failing in Europe.
And then you have the influence of the global stage. Like we discussed in episode 1245, the fraying bond with the diaspora is real. Young Israelis look at the protests on American college campuses, they see the rise of anti-Zionism in the West, and they do not feel a sense of kinship with those progressive movements. They feel under attack. And when a community feels under attack from the outside, it tends to circle the wagons. It reinforces the Fortress Israel mindset. They think, if the world is going to hate us anyway, we might as well be strong and do what we need to do to survive.
It is a defensive crouch, but it is also a confident one. That is the paradox. They are defensive about security, but they are very confident in the Israeli model. They see the West struggling with identity crises and immigration issues, and they look at Israel and see a country with a very clear sense of who it is and why it exists. That clarity is very attractive to young people who are looking for meaning in a chaotic world.
Let us talk about the political parties for a second, because Daniel asked about the specific governments. We have moved from the Mapai dominance to the Likud dominance. But in the last few years, we have seen the rise of parties even further to the right of Likud. Parties like religious Zionism or Utzma Yehudit. These parties are capturing a significant portion of the youth vote. Why? Because they offer a clear, unapologetic ideology. They do not use the nuanced, diplomatic language of the old Likud. They say exactly what they think.
To a young voter who feels that the world is being unfair to Israel, that bluntness is refreshing. They see Netanyahu as a master of the old game, a diplomat who tries to balance too many things, but they see these newer figures as people who are willing to fight the culture war and the security war without apology. It is a move toward a more populist, assertive form of right-wing politics that mirrors some trends in the West, but with a much more intense security focus.
But we should also address a common misconception. A lot of people think this rightward shift means the youth are becoming anti-democratic. I do not think the data supports that. They are very engaged in the democratic process. They just have a different definition of what that democracy should look like. They favor a more majoritarian model where the will of the voters, particularly on security and national identity, is not constantly checked by what they perceive as an unelected judicial elite. That was the whole core of the protest movements regarding judicial reform.
We covered those cracks in the status quo in episode 1336. It is a struggle between different visions of freedom. One vision is about individual rights and judicial oversight, and the other is about national self-determination and the authority of the elected majority. The youth are increasingly landing on the side of national self-determination. They see the court as a remnant of the old Mapai elite that is trying to hold on to power, even though they lost the mandate of the people decades ago.
So where does the center go? Because the center used to be a massive force in Israeli politics. You had parties like Kadima or Yesh Atid that tried to bridge the gap, but in 2026 the center feels increasingly hollowed out. It has become a sort of holding pen for people who are not quite ready to join the hard right, but have completely abandoned the left. The center in Israel today is essentially right-wing on security, but liberal on lifestyle issues.
The problem the center has is that it lacks a compelling narrative for the future. The right has a narrative, strength, tradition, and sovereignty. The left had a narrative, peace, equality, and global integration. The center's narrative is basically, let us just keep things running smoothly and not be too extreme. And in a region as volatile as this, that is not a very inspiring call to action for an 18-year-old who is about to put on a uniform and head to the border.
That's a key observation. The center is managerial. The right is visionary even if you disagree with the vision, and young people are drawn to vision. They want to be part of something larger than themselves. In the early days of the state, that something was the socialist dream of the kibbutz. Today, for many, it is the dream of a strong, unapologetic Jewish state that stands tall.
Building on that, the military's internal culture is shifting too. Historically, the top brass was seen as part of the secular liberal elite. But now, more and more of the officer corps is coming from the religious Zionist community and the periphery. When the people leading the units are coming from a certain ideological background, that filters down to the soldiers. The military is no longer a secularizing force. In many ways, it has become a place where nationalistic and traditionalist values are reinforced and validated.
It is a complete cycle. The home, the school, the military, and then the voting booth. Every step of the way, the current environment reinforces a specific set of values. So, when people ask if this is a permanent realignment, I tend to think it is. This is not a temporary swing of the pendulum. The structural foundations of the old Israeli left have been dismantled. The kibbutzim are privatized, the unions are weakened, and the peace process is a memory. There is nothing to swing back to. The old world is gone.
So, what does this mean for the future? If we look at the post-2026 cohort, the kids who are 10 or 12 years old right now, what is their political world going to look like?
I think we are going to see a further hardening of these lines. But I also think we might see a new kind of internal conflict on the right. As the right becomes the undisputed dominant force, the tensions between the secular right and the religious right will become the primary axis of Israeli politics. It will not be right versus left. It will be about what kind of right-wing country we want to be. Do we want to be a liberal nationalist country that is open to the world, or a more insular, theocratic nationalist country?
That is a crucial distinction, and it is where the real political battles of the next decade will be fought. You can already see it in the debates over the draft for the Hardy community, or the role of religion in public spaces. The right is not a monolith, and the more power it has, the more those internal fractures will show. The youth are not all the same. A secular right-wing voter in Tel Aviv has very different views on Shabbat public transport than a religious voter in Efrat, even if they agree on the security situation.
That's the reality. And for the international community, this is a hard reality to swallow. For decades, the West has been waiting for the Israeli youth to grow up and bring back the peace process. They have been waiting for a younger, more liberal generation to take over and return to the 1992 mindset. But that generation is not coming. If anything, the next generation is going to be even more challenging for the traditional Western diplomatic framework to deal with. They are less interested in Western approval and more focused on regional survival.
It is a classic case of projection. The West projects its own cultural trends onto Israel and is then frustrated when Israel does not follow the script. But Israel is not a Western European country that happens to be in the Middle East. It is a Middle Eastern country that has forged a very specific, very resilient identity based on its own unique history and security needs. The youth here are a product of their environment, and that environment is not the leafy suburbs of London or the campuses of California.
I think one of the practical takeaways for our listeners is to stop looking at Israeli elections through the lens of a standard two-party left-right system. You have to look at the demographic trends and the security reality. If you want to predict where Israel is going, look at the birth rates and look at the threats on the borders. Those are the two most reliable indicators of political direction. The rhetoric is just the surface. The demographics and the security threats are the tectonic plates moving underneath.
And for those trying to track these shifts, keep an eye on the voting patterns in the development towns and the settlements, but also in the tech hubs. If the tech hubs start to shift right, or if they continue to move in that direction, then the transformation is complete. The old elite will have lost its last stronghold. We are already seeing high-tech leaders who are much more comfortable with nationalistic rhetoric than their predecessors were 10 years ago.
It really is a remarkable case study in how a national identity can be totally reconstructed in just a few generations. From the red flags of the May Day parades in Haifa in the 1950s to the flags of the religious Zionist movement today. It is a complete ideological turnover. It is one of the fastest and most thorough political transformations in modern history.
And it was not done by force. It was done through the democratic process and through the sheer reality of living in this part of the world. It is a pragmatic response to an existential situation. You might not like the outcome, but you have to respect the internal logic of it. The Israeli youth are not irrational. They are responding to the world as they see it, not as the world wants them to see it.
Precisely. It is the result of 50 years of history playing out in a very small, very intense pressure cooker. Daniel, thanks for that prompt. It really forced us to connect the dots between the founding of the state and the reality we see on the streets of Jerusalem today in 2026. It is a long arc, but it is a consistent one.
Definitely. It is a lot to chew on. And hey, if you are listening and you are finding these deep dives helpful, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation. We want to hear what you think about these shifts.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. We love seeing the community grow. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today, like episode 991 on the kibbutzim or episode 981 on the global opinion gap, at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there and an RSS feed if you want to subscribe that way.
We are also on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts, and you can join our channel there to get notified every time a new episode drops. We are always posting updates, and sometimes extra context or maps for the topics we cover. It is a great place to engage with the material.
It has been a pleasure as always, Korn. I think I need to go read some more polling data now. I am curious to see if the latest numbers from the March 17th surveys show any further movement in the periphery towns.
I bet they do. The trend seems to be accelerating. Alright, thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you next time.
Take care, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.